following are considered some of the worst bear attacks known to man. These true stories include a brutal grizzly bear attack where a woman was dragged from her tent and eaten while camping at Yellowstone National Park, a case that saw 6 people mauled by a hungry black bear in a single day, and much more. Like and subscribe if you're new. My name is Animal Al, and you're watching When Bears Attack. There's no place on Earth quite like it. Yellowstone National Park, 2.2 million acres of vast wilderness, peppered with vibrant geothermal pools, show-stopping geysers, and miles of boardwalks where 5 million people per year take in the beauty of nature with their families. But beyond the boardwalks, beyond the carefully curated viewpoints, gift shops, and roadside wildlife viewing spots, there's another side of Yellowstone, a wilder, more untouched side, and historically, a much darker side. Meet Yellowstone's backcountry, over 3,000 square miles of towering peaks, raging rivers, dense forests, and frigid alpine lakes. Here, visitors with backcountry permits can be completely away from civilization, surrounded only by the grandeur of nature and the majesty of the animals that live within it. There are wide swaths of land that are 30 miles or more from the nearest road, leaving those who journey into the wilderness to fend completely for themselves against the elements, the harsh landscape, and, at times, the grizzly bears who call it home. The chances of being attacked by a grizzly bear in the developed area of Yellowstone are 1 in 59.5 million overnight visits, but the chances in the backcountry are nearly 30 times higher, at 1 in 1.7 million overnight visits. 24-year-old Brigitta Fredenhagen was tragically part of that 1 in 1.7 million. By all accounts, Brigitta was a free spirit and hard worker who embraced the backcountry with knowledge, respect, and the appropriate amount of caution, only to discover that it still wasn't enough. It was July 28, 1984, when Brigitta entered Yellowstone National Park for the very first time through this entrance with her brother Andreas and his wife. Brigitta and her brother had grown up in Basel, Switzerland. This was the home that she waved goodbye to when they embarked on their once-in-a-lifetime journey together that she had waited her whole life for. Since she was a young child, Brigitta had dreamt of leaving her home just north of the mountainous Alps to experience the vastness of the American West that she had seen on TV. And on that warm summer day in 1984, it was finally happening. The rangers who encountered Brigitta described her as bubbly, adventurous, and eager to learn everything that there was to know about Yellowstone. She was memorable and bright, which only makes what happened to her just 2 days after her arrival that much more horrific. After 2 nights of camping at Grant Village alongside Yellowstone Lake and Norris Campground, the group of 3 would make their way to this ranger station so Brigitta could get a backcountry pass to spend that brave night alone in the Wild West that she had always dreamt of. Andreas and his wife hadn't packed backcountry gear, so they decided to stay at another campsite. No one had any idea that this innocent plan to separate would eventually become one of the main contributing factors that would lead to Brigitta's tragic demise. After speaking with Ranger Gary Youngblood, Brigitta was assigned Site 5B1, just a few miles off the Pelican Valley trailhead. A beautiful trail winding through the tall forests, lush meadows, and along a creek that just so happens to be the perfect habitat for grizzlies. Brigitta was well aware of the dangers that grizzlies potentially posed, and the signs all around the trail and campsites served as a constant reminder. Ranger Youngblood later told investigators that Brigitta showed him books that she had purchased about the trails and the grizzlies, and even asked several questions to ensure that she was doing all that she needed to protect herself. In other words, Brigitta did absolutely everything right in terms of taking precautions. Brigitta, Andreas, and his wife would set off at 11 a.m. on July 30th to enjoy a 5.5-mile hike to Astringent Creek Bridge on the Astringent Creek Trail. It was there that Brigitta hugged her brother and sister-in-law for the last time. They watched as she disappeared into the thick forest of spruce, never to be seen alive again. Brigitta walked further and further into the wilderness alone. Bear bells chimed on her bag, and birds chirped in the forest canopy above her. Though she was assigned Site 5B1, the day was likely passing more quickly than she expected. After several miles of hiking alone, she came to White Lake, an isolated, beautiful body of water deep into the backcountry. There is where she discovered Site 5W1. With the sun beginning to set and no one at the campsite, she decided to settle there for the night instead of her assigned spot. The site was breathtaking, with a spruce understory and a lush meadow just to the south, overflowing with strawberries and elk thistle. Brigitta made camp at that site, her first time sleeping alone in the American West. She set up her tent, started a fire for dinner, and sat by it, enjoying the sunset on the warm summer night. And once again, she was completely isolated, alone, and miles away from anyone who could hear or help her. Following the bear safety guidelines of the time, she climbed a tree and hung her food high off the ground. Then, with night falling, she took a picture of her fire and tent, watched the embers die down, and then crawled into her tent. She then wrote in her journal before bed, reflecting on a trip of a lifetime and ending her entry with, quote, "I've taken all the necessary precautions." As she slept peacefully in her mummy bag, rain began to fall, and a thunderstorm swept over the area, blanketing the night in pitch black, lightning being the only source of natural light, illuminating the tall spruce trees in blinding flashes. It was one of those trees that Yellowstone scientists believe that a subadult male bear began to climb. Its 3 to 4 inch claws easily sliced into the bark of the tree, hauling its several hundred-pound body dozens of feet up with ease. It proceeded to tear down Brigitta's food with a simple swipe as she unknowingly slept just a few feet away. The booming thunder likely drowned the noise out as Brigitta slept peacefully. The bear devoured everything in her food bag: granola, cooked ham, dried fruit, and biscuits. The high caloric content of the food further driving its excitement. As a subadult grizzly, this bear was new to finding food, and since it was alone and without its mother's help, this discovery of filling, energizing human food was sort of like hitting the jackpot. Steve Mealy, a supervisor for Shoshone National Forest, believes that it was this food that enticed the bear to make its next move in search of more. After devouring the food and biting into Brigitta's metal cookpot, the bear lumbered towards the tent. With a single tent, no loud noises, and a source of food nearby, the bear had no reason to be cautious and nothing to fear. Using a single claw, the bear tore through the rainfly and sliced a 27-inch gash in the side of the tent near the door. All the evidence on the scene indicated that Brigitta was asleep as the bear poked his head into the tent. He sniffed the air, then, in an instant, swiftly clamped his massive jaws around Brigitta's head. With no effort whatsoever, the bear dragged her out of the tent by her head, pulling her out into the rain. Brigitta then let out a scream, still trapped in her sleeping bag, as she awakened to this horrible reality. Several feet from her tent, the sleeping bag would then fall off her body as she was dragged into the woods in the pitch black. What happened next can only be assumed by what Ranger Mark Marshall discovered on horseback on August 1st, 1984. When Brigitta hadn't met her brother and sister-in-law at the agreed-upon time, they immediately sensed that something was wrong. Unfortunately, it took rangers several hours to contact a backcountry ranger who could begin the search for Brigitta. Ranger Marshall began looking the night of the 31st, but as night fell, he saw no signs of Brigitta, and with bears roaming in the shadows nearby, he would then suspend the search until the following morning. At 7:30 a.m., Ranger Marshall began the long trek to Brigitta's expected campsite. Along the way, however, he stumbled upon Site 5W1, where an unusual scene awaited him. A sleeping bag was laid outside of the tent, almost as if it was being aired out before being packed away. The campsite was, according to the incident report, so tidy that it seemed almost uncanny. The ranger called and heard no camper in response, which is when his heart sank, because just beyond the sleeping bag were pieces of a human body, sprinkled across the ground. He discovered parts of a human lip, bits of scalp with hair still attached, and sinews of muscle tissue. Over his radio, he called for backup. It was clear that they had a bear attack on their hands. And the most dangerous scene any professional can be forced to combat is an angry bear feeding on a human carcass. More rangers would then arrive, armed with shotguns and rifles. They were tasked with the horrific job of following a trail of body parts north. Along the way, mixed in with the tissue and scalp, they would find a bloody sweatshirt torn to pieces. Horrified but determined to find Brigitta, they continued on until finally they came upon a 2 by 3 foot patch of darkened, oily grass. It appeared to have been where Brigitta bled out after she was dragged from her tent, and likely where the bear began to feed on her in earnest. 250 feet from her tent, a bit further from the likely site of her death, the group of 3 then found her lifeless body. Brigitta was lying on her stomach. Her left arm was tucked beneath her body, and her right was raised over her head. The skin on both her arms had been peeled back to the shoulder by the bear, giving it access to tear away the tissue and fat underneath. It was, undeniably, a scene straight out of a nightmare. The majority of Brigitta's body had been consumed. But perhaps the worst part is how close Brigitta was to avoiding this fate. That fateful night, a group of 3 other campers were assigned to the campsite that she ended up staying at by herself. Unfortunately, due to weather and a late start, those campers never made it to the site. Had they, it's unlikely that the bear would have attacked, as groups of 2 or more are much more of a threat to bears who are by nature risk-averse creatures. If she had continued to her assigned campsite, she may have avoided the bear altogether. It's truly a case of the wrong place, wrong time, because according to the bear experts and the review team at Yellowstone National Park, Brigitta did absolutely everything right in terms of bear safety. Following her death, there was a review of the laws in Pelican Valley, and many of them were updated. Campsites were moved further away from known bear trails and were only assigned to groups of 4 or more. Overnight camping in the area, as far as we can tell, has since been closed, and the trails in the area are only open from sunrise to sunset. Though the attack had a big impact on the park as a whole, it was Brigitta's family who was faced with the majority of the pain from this tragic loss. Just 4 days after her brother and sister-in-law arrived for an amazing trip with her, they were instead flying back to Switzerland with her ashes. Park rangers helped Andreas call his family and tell them the news, organized their flights home, and also provided them both with medication to calm their nerves in the aftermath of the horrible tragedy. With the family flying home to heal, the rangers of the park began their hunt for the bear who killed Brigitta. Based on the length of the bite marks on her body and her cooking pot, it was determined that the bear was a 2 to 3-year-old subadult male, as previously mentioned, and the search began with baited traps. But as days turned to weeks, there were no signs of a bear matching the one that likely killed Brigitta that were found. And just a few weeks later, a preteen boy was dragged out of his campsite just a few miles away in a similar way, grabbed by his head and dragged headfirst out of the tent. Fortunately, he would manage to get away, and this being only because the bear was readjusting its bite and bit his sleeping bag instead of him, allowing him to wiggle out and run to safety. He managed to run straight to his parents, who he startled awake, making him too risky for the bear to continue to pursue. To this day, the bear that killed Brigitta has never been found, and her tragic death remains a reminder that we can take all the necessary precautions, but at the end of the day, nature is a force to be reckoned with, and she will do as she pleases. Glacier National Park, home to stunning, ice-cold glacial lakes, breathtaking alpine trails, and meadows brimming with beautiful wildflowers. But beneath all the Instagram-worthy snapshots, there is something dangerous lurking in the aspen groves and meadows. Glacier is estimated to be home to over 1,000 bears, 700 or so black bears, and approximately 300 of the king of the Americas, the grizzly bear, Ursus arctos. With 4-inch claws, a bite force strong enough to crush a bowling ball, and a top speed of a whopping 35 miles per hour, they've come by that title rightfully. As rare as grizzly attacks on humans are, the ferocity of those attacks has landed grizzlies with a kind of haunting infamy, one they won't be shaking anytime soon. And in the park's history, much of that infamy comes from stories of the fatal attacks in Glacier National Park. There's only been 10. Yet, these attacks live in the nightmares of many. One of these nightmares began on October 3rd, 1992.
And she's right there, and I thought for sure this bear is going to eat me.
Buck Wild has never been a stranger to the dangers that grizzly bears pose. In his 30s, he quit his prolific job as an electrical engineer contracted by the CIA and turned to the great outdoors, giving up everything to be a wildlife photographer. The animal that immediately captured his heart from behind the lens was the grizzly bear, specifically the grizzlies located in Katmai National Park, which are known for being more tolerant and docile than their counterparts in other areas of the world. The steady supply of salmon and rich food sources of the Katmai ecosystem means they don't have to be particularly predatory or territorial. But in Glacier, things are very different, especially as fall is turning to winter and bears are forced to put on the pounds before hibernation. Buck knew this, and he came to Glacier prepared. Eager to get some bear photos to sell, he set out to an area that he knew they frequented, the Loop Trail, a 4-mile trail with a 2,600-foot elevation gain up to the Granite Park Chalet, a backcountry lodging spot. It is one of the wildest, albeit most beautiful trails in the entire park, and Buck didn't have to wait long to find exactly what he was looking for. As dawn rose over the chilly October morning, Buck enjoyed breakfast at the Granite Park backcountry campsite. Despite his name, he wasn't as wild as you'd expect when it came to bear safety. As he ate, he spotted a cub racing through the woods. Then, somewhere in the underbrush, the woof of the mother bear following behind. He waited, still and silent, for several minutes, allowing the bears to press on. Then he did exactly what he should have to keep himself as well as the bear safe. He took all of his scented items, including his food and toiletries, and strung them up in a tree. Then he grabbed a can of bear spray, his camera, as well as his backpack before journeying on. At that point, he was about 15 minutes behind the bears, but to him, that was the perfect place to be. Far enough back to lower his chances of surprising the bears, but close enough to be able to follow their trail. His livelihood depended on getting pictures of these bears, and with the bear spray in hand as a deterrent and years of experience under his belt, Buck felt comfortable with what he was walking into. However, if he had known what was to come, he wouldn't have taken another step. Buck was scouring the trail as he walked, fully alert. He scanned the thick trees and brush on the edges of the alpine trail, looking for any signs of a bear. But what he found was the last thing that he expected. Lying in the dirt in the center of the trail was a blue baseball hat. Buck froze as an icy feeling crept through him. This wasn't right, and as he proceeded to search the surroundings, he would stumble upon even more evidence of what he feared the most. At the edge of the trail, a red backpack, a camera, and a tripod had been abandoned, and there were drag marks in the dirt. Knowing he'd likely stumbled on an attack site mere minutes after it happened, he backed down the trail about 30 yards. That's when things got worse. At the edge of the trail, there was a flash of red, a pool of blood over a foot wide, sitting on top of the soil in a still warm blob. It was at this point that Buck knew just how unsafe he was. Firstly, he knew that the grizzly he had seen had cubs. There's a reason the phrase mama bear exists. Unlike black bears, grizzly bears are known to defend their cubs, even if it means facing their own death. The bear he had seen had at least one cub to protect. Then there was the time of the year. With hibernation on the horizon, and their survival depending on how much weight they can put on before then, bears are often willing to take bigger risks than ever to get food. And finally, the fact that the bear's food was likely whoever had been unfortunate enough to be attacked just mere feet away from him. If the bear was feeding on the carcass, Buck didn't doubt for 1 second that she would be trying to defend or kill. Yet, he had to know if the victim was still alive. He was faced with an impossible problem. Walk closer to danger and potentially save someone's life, or walk into danger and have his own come to an end. Bravely, Buck tightened the grip around his bear spray and followed the trail back into the woods. As he did, slowly, his senses heightened, and he found himself following a path of horrific destruction. First, he came across ripped pieces of clothing, then coins glistening with specks of blood, and finally, mixed in amongst the wreckage, pieces of torn human flesh. His stomach was tight. He felt like he could hear every single blade of grass rustling, every bug scampering through the underbrush. He knew that at any moment, the low huff of a grizzly might be all he got as a warning. But that noise never came. Instead, the sight of a man lying on his side, dead. Most of his skin had been torn away from his leg, thigh, butt, and arm. His eyes were closed. Buck raced to his side to take a pulse, but with adrenaline racing, he couldn't be too sure whether he'd felt one or not. Regardless, he wanted to do all that he could to try and keep the man alive, just in case there was at least some life left in him that he was still managing to cling on to. He ran back to his backpack, digging through to see if he could find a jacket to cover the man with. At the least, it would keep him warm and offer his wounds at least a tiny bit of protection. But in the 2 minutes it took him to grab the jacket and return to the wounded man, he was gone. In his place was a trail of blood and drag marks from the bear. The trail descended deeper and deeper into the dark woods. Now, Buck knew with certainty that the bear wasn't just protecting her cubs, she was hunting. He cautiously made his way back to the trail, knowing that there wasn't much hope in attempting to save this poor person now. But if anyone else disturbed the bear feeding, it could result in even more deaths. Buck couldn't let that happen. He left a note on the trail, along with a can of bear spray. That note read, "Help. Discovered signs of bear mauling about a quarter to a half mile down from chalet backcountry campsite. Followed another quarter mile and found body. He was in bad shape, but alive. Went back to get coat to cover him, but body was gone. Met people here. I plan to stay here for 2 reasons. 1, to turn people back toward Logan's Pass, and 2, to take National Park personnel to the spot that I saw the victim last. Seriously, Buck Wild." And those 2 things are exactly what Buck did. Logan Pass was the trail going toward the Granite Park Chalet, where people would stop, then continue along the trail. Anyone continuing on the trail ran the risk of a deadly encounter. Buck hurried up to the Granite Park Chalet, warning everyone who came that they needed to turn around and head back down to Logan Pass to safety. There is no telling how many lives this action potentially saved. But the remoteness caused an issue. There were no rangers nearby, and no way to contact them but to send people up to Logan Pass away from the bear, hoping they'd be able to find a ranger soon. As the hours passed and morning slipped to afternoon, 2 park rangers finally arrived at the chalet in a helicopter. They had received word from someone who found Buck's note at the bottom of the loop trail. Buck guided these rangers to the last place he had seen the body of the bear attack victim. In the few hours that had passed, the man had been dragged another 400 feet away. His body was covered in dirt, a technique called caching, used by bears to hide the scent of their kill. Tragically, the man was dead and likely had been for hours. His name was John Petryani. He grew up in Oak Creek, Wisconsin, and was the son of a Romanian immigrant, John Sr. His obituary described him as a longtime observer and student of nature, and looking at his history, that couldn't be more of the truth. Every year he would save up from his job as the coordinator of the city of Madison, Wisconsin's custodial department, and use that money to go on a 3-week trip to explore the outdoors. In 1992, that trip took him to Banff, Jasper, and finally, Glacier National Park. The day that he had been mauled was the very last day of his trip. And now Buck and the Rangers had to find a way to get him home so his family could say a proper goodbye. Their plan sounded simple at first. Get a helicopter, put John's body in it, and fly him out of the park. But things immediately took a turn for the worse. As the crew made their way back to the chalet, they came face to face with the female bear and her cubs. The Rangers drew their rifles, prepared to put the bear down if necessary. She charged them once, twice, 3 times, 4 bluff charges of absolute power and control. And even years afterward, Buck remembers the strength of the bear and her year-old cubs, but everyone had to stay calm. They couldn't run, flinch, or cower because if they did, they too would most likely end up having the same fate as John.
And don't run or scream or panic and lose your mind for any reason, no matter what happens, because that will evoke a predatory attack.
One of the rangers, Charlie Logan, remembers having his finger on the trigger of his gun. In his mind, one thought played over and over: if she steps toward me, I'm gonna fire. Miraculously, she didn't. Convinced the threat was neutralized and no longer worth her time, she retreated to her cubs and disappeared into the underbrush. The crew hurried back to the chalet with a plan in place. One ranger would go in a helicopter to monitor from above and haze the bear if necessary, while 5 other rangers would approach on foot, prepare the body, and load it into the helicopter. However, once more, things didn't go as planned. For 2 days, thick fog and rain stopped any helicopter from flying. When it finally arrived and the rangers set the plan into motion, they were met with yet another problem. The choppers sent ahead spotted the bear and her 2 cubs. Wanting to haze them, the pilot swept down, flying low over their heads. Usually, just the sound of a helicopter is enough to scare a bear off. But this bear continued, undeterred, heading straight for the rangers on their mission. In a scramble, armed if necessary, the 5 rangers on the ground prepped John's body. They managed to get him in the helicopter and take off, sailing high above Glacier National Park. Meanwhile, his family in Wisconsin was preparing for the long journey to Montana to identify his body. Tragically, they had already suffered several losses. In 1975, John's brother Paul died in a motorcycle crash on the Angeles Crest Highway in California, and for an entire year, his family had no idea what had happened to him. They not only knew what had happened to one of the Petryani boys, but they also got a farewell. The day the family was set to travel to Montana, they received a postcard from John. He had sent it just days before his death, when he was in Kalispell. Seeing the letter was bittersweet, as was the fate of the bear. Park officials determined that John had likely accidentally startled the bear, resulting in a defensive attack. However, they believed that due to the time of the year, this turned into a predatory attack. After 9 days of searching, rangers managed to find the bear and the cubs that they believed were responsible for John's death. The mother grizzly was much smaller than she should have been for that time of the year, and she had a rotten tooth, which likely contributed to her preying on a human rather than her typical food sources. While it may seem cruel to put the bear and her cubs down, the liability that bears who have attacked humans pose is just too great. And Buck was shaken from the ordeal, would regardless not let this stop his love of nature. And in the decades since, he worked with BBC, PBS, and National Geographic as a wildlife behaviorist, photographer, and cinematographer. And despite what he's seen, he still firmly believes that the beauty of nature is worth every second of the danger. Most bear attacks happen deep in the wild, far from anyone else and far from any kind of help. But this one was different. It happened at a family campground in front of witnesses on a summer evening that was otherwise supposed to be peaceful. This is the horrifying true story of the Liard River Hot Springs bear attack, one that saw multiple people severely mauled by a large black bear, 2 of which lost their lives. Patti McConnell and her 2 children, Kelly and Kristen, were in the midst of a long journey, driving from Paris, Texas, all the way to their new home in Alaska. Along the way, they decided to stop at Liard River Hot Springs to rest and unwind, which was much needed as it's a very long drive, and they were doing this just before continuing their drive north. Now, this park is located in northern British Columbia and is known as one of Canada's largest hot springs. It's famous for its warm waters and lush plant life. Eager to unwind and get settled in, the trio quickly changed into their swimsuits and headed down to the lower pool. The water was warm, it was inviting, and especially after being on the road for so long, the trio really just quickly settled in for this relaxing soak before deciding that they were going to check out the more secluded upper pool. But 7-year-old Kristen couldn't wait for this. She was as restless as ever. She really didn't stay long and decided to go straight to the lower pool with some new friends that she just made. Now, worried about her safety, Patti and Kelly decided to follow her. And as they made their way toward the hanging gardens, Kelly pointed out a spot where they could check out some exotic plants, something the 2 were into. So the 2 of them climbed a short set of steps through the bush to a viewing platform. They paused for a moment, taking in the lush greenery and those exotic plants that they were really into. However, neither of them noticed that the bushes were rustling right beside the boardwalk. And as Patti began stepping carefully down the wet stairs, something abruptly caught her. she suddenly locked eyes with a large adult male black bear sitting in the shrubs. It was calmly chewing on a dogwood branch. Stunned, Patti whispered urgently to her son, "Kelly, bear." Now at first, Kelly thought she was just joking until he turned around and came face to face with a now towering black bear standing on its hind legs. Now realizing just how serious the situation was, he quietly warned his mom, "Don't move, just stay still." And just as Kelly started inching closer to her, the bear let out a sharp grunt and lunged straight through the railing onto the boardwalk. Panicked, Kelly shouted, "Mom, run." Patti bolted up the stairs as fast as she could toward the viewing platform, but the bear was right behind her. And with a running speed of up to 35 miles per hour, Kelly watched in horror as his mother didn't stand a chance, and this bear caught up to her within seconds, knocked her to the ground, and clamped its powerful jaws around her torso. Now, despite being unarmed and his small and scrawny frame, Kelly didn't hesitate. He charged at this bear, kicking it in the face and shouting for it to get off his mother. The massive animal then grunted, barely flinching, and then turned its attention back to Patti, ignoring Kelly completely. Kelly at this point was fueled by pure adrenaline and rage. He quickly scanned the area for anything that he could use as a weapon, something that could hopefully even make this bear flinch. This is when he spotted a broken tree limb. He grabbed it and began swinging it over and over at this bear's head. And he was doing this all while screaming for help at the top of his lungs. In the chaos, he caught a glimpse of his mother's blood. This blood was glistening on the bear's teeth, and this prompted something really primal inside him to snap. He swung again, landing a solid hit right across the bear's nose, and this time, he did get this bear's attention. This bear started to roar, now it was in some pain, and this time the bear lashed out with its powerful paws right at Kelly, raking deep claw marks into his neck and shoulders. Then it easily overpowered him, sank its teeth into his waist, and swung him through the air as if he was a rag doll. Now, bears are of course super mighty, and even though this was a black bear, they can get up to 600 pounds, so it's no joke. Kelly could feel himself slipping into unconsciousness as the bear hurled him onto the deck with tremendous force, leaving him curled up beside his motionless mother. Now, barely conscious and bleeding, Kelly tried to crawl toward Patti, but the bear came at him again at this point, biting down and tearing at his flesh, causing him to scream in agony, all while fighting the urge to throw up from the rancid smell of its breath. At that moment, Kelly knew that death was near. He closed his eyes and basically started waiting for the inevitable. This is when Ray Kitchen, a 56-year-old trucker from Fort Nelson, BC, would arrive at the scene. He'd been relaxing with his daughter Jolene nearby when he'd heard Kelly and Patti's screams. Also grabbing a fallen tree branch, he started pounding it against the railing, trying to fend the bear off. Realizing that this bear wasn't intimidated, Kitchen then dropped the branch that he was using, grabbed a larger one, and basically shoved this branch into the bear's belly as hard as he could. Now, he did this in order to try to force it away from Kelly, but this action only made things worse. The bear then fully turned on Kitchen, charging at him full speed, slamming into him, and knocking him straight through the railing into the bushes below. Panicked, Kitchen scrambled onto his knees toward a nearby tree, shielding his head with his hands as the bear swiped at him with its claws, and he was screaming for help at this point. And this is when the commotion was heard by another man, Tony Dock. Now, this man rushed toward the scene, and ahead of him on the boardwalk, there were other people running, and included in this crowd were 71-year-old Frank Headingham, Ingrid Bailey, who was a wilderness firefighter and paramedic from Felton, California, as well as her friend, Brad Westervelt. They'd already heard the shouts. They heard "Help, bear, get a gun," and they were moving quickly toward the parking lot. They were trying to exit the park. They were trying to do this with the rest of the panicked crowd, but unlike most, Bailey, Westervelt, and Headingham, they were no strangers to bears, and instead of fleeing, they grabbed sticks and chunks of wood and headed straight toward the danger. When they reached the viewing platform, the scene below was horrifying. Two bloodied bodies lay sprawled out across the deck now. The bear had Kitchen in its grip, its jaws clamped around his arm and shoulder, and claws tearing into his flesh. It was also basically feeding on him at this point. This bear was likely starving, which is why it decided to go for these humans. However, I do also want to mention that Liard Hot Springs, This park specifically really food habituated these bears. The bears in this park, they were used to humans feeding them, and they were used to eating off human scraps. They weren't scared of humans, so this really played a big part in this bear's nature and mentality and reaction towards humans. Just something to note. So back to the story, Doc and Westervelt spotted a thick tree trunk nearby as well, and they too would grab this and use it as a battering ram. Even with both of them pushing and trying to attack this bear, they couldn't drive the relentless creature away. And this is when Bailey quickly realized that they really needed a gun. She started looking around frantically for the park ranger. Westervelt took off to find help, while Hedingham, despite being super exhausted and having a bad history of heart attacks, he stayed behind trying to fight the bear. This is when suddenly the bear shifted its focus once again. It turned back toward Kitchen and this time attacked with full force, striking him one more time and tossing him violently into the air, killing him instantly. And as all this happened, Bailey meanwhile rushed to Patti's side. She checked for a pulse and tried to resuscitate her as best as she could, even though deep down she already knew that it was most likely already too late for her. At the same time, Hedingham went to Kelly, who had just regained consciousness and was still desperately trying to reach his mother. And as they were tending to him, the massive black bear would appear once again, stepping back onto the deck. Fueled by anger that all these people are hurt, Hedingham then kicked the bear hard with his hiking boots, knocking it slightly off balance, but really it didn't do much, and instead of retreating, the animal turned and began moving toward the boardwalk, where more people were still gathered. Kelly begged Hedingham to help his mother, but Hedingham told him softly, "Don't move, just breathe slowly. We're doing everything that we can." Using his knowledge of first aid, Hedingham pulled a handkerchief from his jacket and began cleaning the worst of Kelly's wounds. At the same time, Bailey realized they needed towels to use as compresses and also more hands to help with CPR. It was just then, with perfect timing, a group of men came rushing up the stairs, one of them carrying a towel, and another was fortunately in fact trained in CPR. Hedingham and the man with the towel worked together to bind Kelly's wounds, while another man joined Bailey, helping her perform chest compressions as she tried mouth-to-mouth resuscitation on Patti. By now, the bear had already disappeared into the forest, but Bailey couldn't help but wonder where this park ranger was. Hedingham then shouted that they really needed to get these victims to a hospital, and so he took off to go find more help. Around that time, a man named Vandervelden, a research assistant from University of Calgary, he came running down the upper pool with a few other bathers to see what was happening. Amidst all the chaos, someone suddenly shouted, "The bear's coming, run for your lives." People scattered in every direction at this point, and in the midst of this panic, Vandervelden slipped and fell into the bushes. Now, this happened right as the bear was charging, and since he was so vulnerable at this point, the bear pounced on him and began mauling him viciously. He kicked and pulled at the bear's nose and ears, but this wouldn't help. In fact, it caused the bear to be even more violent, and its teeth and its claws just began tearing into this man's flesh. Meanwhile, Hedingham had reached the park ranger's office. He quickly explained what was happening to Ranger Dave Webb, who grabbed 2 rifles from his motorhome, a Winchester 30-30 and a Remington 223. And he was joined by a young man named Dwayne Eggbrotten, whom he quickly asked if he'd know how to use a gun, to which he said yes, and so they rushed toward the scene. Eggbrotten reached the boardwalk first, and from below he could hear faint moans of Vandervelden and saw the bear crouched over him. It was feeding on him. And so, taking careful aim at the back of the bear's neck, Eggbrotten fired a single, precise shot that caused the bear to collapse instantly. Even though he knew that this shot was fatal, Eggbrotten would fire 2 more rounds just to make sure that this bear was truly dead. And back on the viewing platform, Bailey was still tending to Patti and her son when she heard the gunshots echo through the forest, and this caused her to say, "Shoot it again," because she was so fired up from all this that was happening. She was so upset at this bear for killing this mother and essentially almost killing her son. And so, with that final shot, the terrifying tragedy at Liard River Hot Springs was finally over. Though Patti McConnell lost her life that afternoon, both Kelly McConnell and Ari Vandervelden survived. And this was thanks to the incredible courage, of course, of Ray Kitchen, Ingrid Bailey, Frank Hedingham, and the others who risked everything, including their lives, to help. They were airlifted to a hospital, and after a time, they recovered from their treatment as well as their severe injuries. More than 500 mourners gathered in Fort Nelson on August 22nd, 1997 to honor the bravery of Ray Kitchen. Now, it's important that I mention this. While researching this case, I came across some really conflicting information about the names specifically of the people who were involved. Every name I've mentioned so far, it was verified through official records, except for Dwayne Eggbrotten and Dave Webb. I couldn't find much reliable information on these people when it comes to this case. If any of you watching do happen to know more, maybe from local reports, family connections, or firsthand details, drop a comment down below, please, and help fill in those blanks. I'd really appreciate it. It's very unfortunate 2 people lost their lives. I do want to mention that most bear attacks, they happen in the way that the other bear attacks that I've covered in this channel happen. I will leave an episode for you at the end screen of this video of a bear attack if you want to check it out. There's one that happened in Yellowstone that has done some really good numbers and a lot of people found interesting. Definitely do check that one out. And also, if you want to check out our last video, which I posted last week, this is about a crocodile attack, a woman that was death rolled, in fact, by a crocodile multiple times and actually survived the ordeal. This was one of the most insane cases I've ever heard of crocodile attacks. I really think you guys should check it out if you haven't already. Once again, thank you so much for all the early support. You guys may know me from When Animals Attack. My name is Animal Al. I don't own that channel anymore. However, this is where you can find me now. This is where I'm making content now. You can join our Patreon if you'd like to support this channel. The Patreon link is in the description. Stay safe out there. Till next time.